Story 1 Whispers from the Abyss, the Forgotten Curse of Blackwater Lake. Blackwater Lake, nestled deep in the untouched wilderness, had long been a place of beauty shrouded in mystery. For decades, it was a secret fishing spot for only the bravest souls. The lake, as its name suggested, was inky and unnaturally dark, almost as if its depths held more than just fish. Local fishermen had spoken in hushed tones about its eerie silence, how even the birds avoided it, how nothing but the wind disturbed its surface. Decades ago, Blackwater Lake was the site of an unsolved tragedy. In the late 1950s, a small fishing community had formed around the lake, where locals depended on its abundant waters. But one fateful night during a routine fishing trip, an entire crew of 5 men disappeared without a trace. When their boat was found, it was drifting aimlessly near the center of the lake. Not a soul remained, and there were no signs of struggle except for strange, deep gouges along the hull and nets torn to shreds, as if something massive had ripped through them. Rumors of a curse spread through the town, and people stopped coming to the lake. Over the years, it became a forgotten place, with no one daring to venture back. Until now. It was a chilly October afternoon when Mark, a passionate angler, convinced 3 of his friends Tom, Eddie, and Jake to join him on a weekend fishing trip to the infamous Blackwater Lake. Mark had heard the old legends but dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories meant to scare kids away. He was sure the lake, untouched for decades, would offer the best fishing they had ever experienced. The group arrived at the lake just before dusk. It was as breathtaking as it was unnerving. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the darkening sky above. The dense forest surrounding the lake seemed to close in, making the entire area feel isolated, as if time itself had forgotten the place. As they set up camp near the shore, they noticed something strange. There were no sounds of wildlife. No birds chirping, no rustling in the bushes, not even the typical buzz of insects. The silence was unnerving, but they brushed it off, eager to get out on the water. The first evening on the lake was uneventful. They paddled out in a small rented boat, casting their lines and relaxing under the dimming twilight. But as night fell, things began to change. A thick fog rolled in unnaturally fast, enveloping the lake in an eerie blanket of mist. The moonlight barely penetrated the haze, leaving them surrounded by darkness. Then came the whispers. At first it was so faint they thought they were hearing things, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift across the water. The sound grew louder, but every time one of them shined a flashlight into the mist, the lake remained still empty. They joked nervously about the legend of the missing fisherman but couldn't shake the growing unease. Suddenly, Eddie's line tugged violently. He struggled to reel it in, but the resistance was unlike anything he'd ever felt. It was as if something enormous was fighting against him. With a final, terrifying jolt, the line snapped, sending Eddie tumbling backward. The force was so strong it nearly dragged him overboard. Shaken, they decided to call it a night, paddling back to shore with an unsettling feeling in their guts. But sleep didn't come easy. All night, strange noises echoed from the lake's soft splashes, distant murmurs, and an occasional scraping sound like something hard and sharp dragging against the boat. The next morning, the fog had cleared, but the tension among the group was palpable. Determined to prove that nothing was wrong, Mark suggested they head out again. By midday, they had caught nothing. The fish seemed to have disappeared from the lake, which was strange for such a well-known fishing spot. That evening, Tom decided to stay back at the camp to rest while the others ventured out again. As they reached deeper waters, the sky turned a bruised shade of red as the sun dipped below the horizon. Once again, the strange whispers began, only this time they seemed to form words, low and incomprehensible, almost beckoning. Eddie, clearly unnerved, suddenly pointed toward the center of the lake. "Did you see that?" he stammered. At first, Mark and Jake thought he was imagining things. But then they saw it too, an unnatural ripple in the water, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface, creating a slow, swirling current. It was heading toward them. panicked. They reeled in their lines and tried to row back to shore, but it was as if the boat was caught in an invisible force, pulling them back toward the center of the lake. The whispers grew louder, the water around them bubbling as if something was rising. Without warning, the boat lurched, tipping violently to the side. Jake tumbled overboard, disappearing beneath the surface before anyone could react. Mark and Eddie frantically searched the water, but there was no sign of him. It was as if the lake had swallowed him whole. In their panic, they managed to regain control of the boat and rowed as fast as they could back to shore. When they stumbled into camp, Tom was gone. His tent was still there, but it looked as though something had torn through it, the fabric shredded and covered in mud and water. With no time to think, they grabbed what they could and ran for the woods, but the whispers followed them. The trees seemed to close in, branches reaching out like skeletal hands. They could feel something watching them, something ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the shadows. As they ran, Mark tripped and fell, cutting his leg on a sharp rock. Eddie stopped to help, but when he looked back toward the lake, his face turned white. From the water, dark figures were emerging, shadowy forms that looked almost human but twisted and malformed, their bodies dripping with lake water, their hollow eyes fixed on the fleeing men. The whispers were now deafening, like a chorus of tortured souls. Mark and Eddie sprinted through the forest, the ground beneath them soft and wet, as if the earth itself was trying to pull them down. They could hear the splashing footsteps behind them, growing closer. Just when they thought they couldn't run any further, they broke through the tree line and reached their car. Without a second thought, they jumped in and sped away, the lake disappearing into the distance behind them. The whispers faded, but the memory of what they had seen would haunt them forever. Weeks later, search parties combed the lake for Jake and Tom, but nothing was ever found. The authorities chalked it up to an unfortunate accident, but Mark and Eddie knew the truth: something far worse lurked in Blackwater Lake. Both men were never the same after the trip. Eddie moved away, refusing to speak of what had happened, while Mark became obsessed with uncovering the mystery of the lake. He spent months researching local legends and uncovered a dark history. Blackwater Lake had been the site of ancient rituals, sacrifices to a creature said to dwell in its depths, a creature that fed on souls. To this day, no one fishes at Blackwater Lake. Locals claim that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers calling from the abyss. And sometimes when the mist rolls in, shadowy figures can be seen standing silently on the shore, waiting for their next victim. The drowned awns of Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek was a name passed down through generations with whispers of caution, fear, and loss. Deeper than the dense woods of Appalachia, the creek was more of a river, winding through the mountains, its dark waters cutting through the earth like a black scar. To the locals, it wasn't just another fishing spot. Stories told of people going missing, their bodies never found, as if the creek itself swallowed them whole. The most notorious tale was of a family that vanished in the 1930s. They were a poor family who lived off the land, fishing at the creek daily for food. One night, the small cabin was found empty, with a trail of wet footprints leading from the creek to their door. The door was broken inward, as though someone or something had forced its way in. But there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, just silence. The family was never seen again. The creek had taken them, locals said, joining the countless others lost to its depths. But to Jack and his friends, Hollow Creek was the ultimate challenge. Jack, Chris, and Devin had been fishing together for years, searching for the most isolated and untouched spots. The trio had heard the stories about Hollow Creek but dismissed them as nonsense. After all, it was just water. Jack, the ringleader, was particularly excited about the trip. He had heard rumors that the fish in Hollow Creek were bigger than any in the surrounding lakes, untouched, wild, and ancient. In late October, they packed their gear and set off for a weekend camping trip deep into the woods. The journey to Hollow Creek wasn't easy. There was no road leading to it anymore, only a half-forgotten trail that wound through thick underbrush. The forest was unnervingly quiet as they made their way deeper into the mountains. No birds sang, no animals stirred. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. By the time they reached Hollow Creek, dusk had fallen. The water was a deep inky black, reflecting the darkening sky. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, the three friends set up camp by the water's edge, eager to start fishing. The creek was larger than they expected, with wide bends and deep pools where the current barely moved. Perfect for a weekend of fishing. As night fell, they lit a fire and cast their lines into the still waters. Hours passed, and the moon rose high into the sky, casting a pale glow over the campsite. It was Chris who first noticed something strange. His line had gone taut, but when he began to reel it in, it felt like he had hooked something massive. He tugged and pulled, but the resistance was too strong. Then, suddenly, the line snapped with an eerie finality. The pole nearly ripped from his hands. "What the hell was that?" Chris muttered, staring at the water, now eerily calm. Jack laughed it off, teasing him about snagging a tree stump, but the tension was undeniable. Soon after, Devin hooked something too, but as he began to reel it in, the same thing happened. The line went tight, then snapped as though pulled by something far larger than a fish. They began to feel uneasy. Jack suggested they call it a night and try again in the morning when they had more daylight to see what was happening in the water. But as they gathered around the fire, strange sounds began to echo from the creek. At first, it was just the gentle sloshing of the current, but then came something else, a soft splashing, rhythmic, like someone wading through the shallow waters. They listened intently, shining their flashlights toward the sound, but saw nothing. The noise continued, circling their campsite. Whatever it was moving in a slow, deliberate manner. But when they called out, there was no response. By morning, the eerie sounds had stopped, and the men were eager to get back to fishing, dismissing the previous night as their imaginations getting the better of them. As the sun rose, they spread out along the creek's banks, determined to catch something worthy of the trip. It was Jack who first landed a fish, but as he reeled it in, he noticed something unsettling. The fish was enormous, larger than any they'd ever seen, but its scales were sickly and gray, and its eyes were milky white. It looked as if it had been dead for years, yet it wriggled in Jack's hands alive. Chris and Devin gathered around, staring at the monstrous fish in silent horror. They debated what to do, but Jack, determined not to be outdone by a creepy fish, threw his line back into the water, trying to brush off the feeling of unease that gnawed at him. That's when it happened. Devin, further down the creek, let out a yell. His pole had bent nearly in half, the line racing through the water at a speed impossible for any normal fish. Jack and Chris rushed over as Devin struggled to control the rod, the reel screaming under the pressure. Then, with a violent jerk, Devin was pulled off balance and tumbled into the creek. He watched in horror as the water churned around Devin, his face frozen in a mix of terror and confusion. He tried to swim to the surface, but something beneath the water was holding him down. His screams were cut short as he was dragged beneath the surface, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Jack and Chris stood frozen, staring at the spot where their friend had vanished. The creek was still once again, as if nothing had happened. For hours they searched the creek, calling Devin's name, diving into the water, but there was no trace of him. The water was too dark, too deep, and it seemed to shift and ripple with every step they took. Exhausted and terrified, they finally returned to the camp, their minds racing with panic. They debated whether to pack up and leave or search for Devin in the morning, but something deep inside told them it was too late. Devin was gone, taken by the creek. As night fell once more, the same rhythmic splashing returned. This time it was closer. Jack and Chris huddled near the fire, their flashlights flickering in the cold night air. They could feel it now, the oppressive presence watching them, lurking just beyond the firelight. Suddenly, the sounds changed. It wasn't just the splashing anymore. It was whispers, soft, low murmurs rising from the water, carried on the wind. They couldn't make out the words, but the voices sounded distorted, like they were coming from underwater. Then they saw them figures emerging from the water, slowly rising from the creek's depths. At first they thought it was their imagination, but the figures became clearer, their shapes grotesque and unnatural. Pale, waterlogged faces, hair hanging in clumps, eyes wide and vacant like those of the dead. The drowned ones. Chris screamed and bolted into the woods, but Jack stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the figures. There were more now, rising from the creek bed, their bony hands reaching out toward him. But he could hear the faint, gurgling whispers clearer now, as if they were calling his name, begging him to join them beneath the water. Jack's instincts finally kicked in. He grabbed his gear and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. And he could hear Chris somewhere in the woods, but the voices were louder, surrounding him on all sides. The drowned Orns were coming after them, dragging their bloated, dripping bodies through the underbrush, their pale hands clawing at the ground. He didn't stop running until he reached the old trail. The figures had disappeared, and the voices were gone, but the feeling of being watched, being hunted remained. He found Chris near the trailhead, shaking and wide-eyed, babbling incoherently about the faces in the water. The two of them didn't stop until they were miles away from Hollow Creek. By the time they reached town, it was already daylight, but the terror of the previous night still clung to them. They tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed them. Devon was never found, and the authorities wrote it off as a drowning accident. But Jack and Chris knew the truth. Hollow Creek had taken him, just as it had taken so many before. Neither of them ever returned to the woods. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, Jack would hear the faint whispers in his dreams, the voices of the drowned Orns calling him back to the water. Story 3. The Siren's Curse of Deadmans Cove. Off the northern coast of Maine lies a small, secluded inlet known as Deadmans Cove, a place untouched by time. With its towering cliffs, treacherous currents, and rocky shoreline, it was avoided by sailors and fishermen for centuries. The cove was notorious for shipwrecks, with dozens of vessels vanishing into its dark waters over the years. The locals whispered tales of ghostly figures seen wandering the cliffs and strange, melodic sounds heard drifting from the cove at night, sounds that drew sailors to their doom. There was one tale that persisted above all others, the legend of the Siren of Deadmans Cove. According to the old mariners, a beautiful woman lived beneath the waves, luring men with her haunting song, calling them into the water, where she would drag them to the depths, never to be seen again. Some believed she was the spirit of a shipwrecked woman, seeking revenge on the sea that claimed her life. Others said she was something far older, a creature of the deep, born to feed on the souls of men. For years, the cove remained undisturbed, a place spoken of only in whispers, until now. Tom, a passionate fisherman, had heard the stories about Deadman's Cove but never took them seriously. To him, it was just another spot on the map, an unexplored gem that could yield incredible catches. When his friend Doug suggested a weekend fishing trip to the cove, Tom jumped at the chance. They had both grown tired of the overfished waters of the nearby harbors and sought something new, something untamed. What better place than a spot that no one dared to fish? Along with their friends, Pete and Alan, the four men packed their gear and set out in Tom's boat for the isolated cove. As they sailed closer, the cliffs loomed above them, casting long shadows over the water as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The place felt desolate, abandoned by the world, with only the distant crash of waves against the rocks breaking the eerie silence. As they rounded the final bend, the cove opened up before them. The water was unusually still, almost too calm for the ocean. The cliffs, jagged and high, created a natural amphitheater, trapping the sound of the waves in a constant, low echo. The group anchored their boat in the shallows and began to set up their lines, eager to begin. The fishing was remarkable. Within minutes of casting their lines, they were reeling in massive, healthy fish. The sheer number of catches was unlike anything they had ever experienced, and for hours the group laughed and cheered as they filled the cooler with their haul. It seemed as though the cove was untouched by human hands, a hidden paradise for fishermen. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The winds died down, and the air grew thick, heavy, with a strange chill that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The waves, which had been calm all day, became restless, lapping against the boat in uneven rhythms. Then they heard it. A soft, melodic hum, barely audible at first, drifted across the water. It was a woman's voice, singing a tune that none of them recognized, but it was hauntingly beautiful. The sound was captivating, like a lullaby from a distant dream. Tom stopped mid-reel, his eyes scanning the cliffs for any sign of the source. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Doug nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from the shore." The singing grew louder, more pronounced, and with it came an overwhelming sense of calm. The others felt it too, a strange pull toward the shore, an urge to get closer, to find the source of the beautiful song. Without thinking, Tom began pulling up the anchor, steering the boat toward the beach. As they neared the shore, the song intensified. The once serene melody now carried an undercurrent of longing, as though the singer was calling to them, beckoning them closer. The men were entranced, their minds foggy, as if the song had wrapped itself around their thoughts. They reached the beach, their boots sinking into the wet sand as they dragged the boat ashore. The air felt colder here, and a dense fog began to roll in from the ocean, blanketing the cove in an ethereal mist. The singing had stopped, replaced by the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks. Suddenly, Pete stumbled forward, his eyes wide. "There," he shouted, pointing toward the base of the cliffs. Through the mist, they saw her standing ankle-deep in the water, her back to them. She was impossibly beautiful, her long dark hair cascading down her back, her pale skin glowing in the fading light. She wore a thin white dress that clung to her body, wet and translucent. The sight of her was mesmerizing, and for a moment they forgot where they were. The woman turned slowly, her eyes locking onto theirs. Her face was even more beautiful up close, her features delicate and perfect. But there was something wrong with her eyes, black and hollow, like two deep pits leading into nothingness. The sight of them sent a cold shiver down Tom's spine. But before he could speak, she smiled, revealing a row of sharp, jagged teeth. "Run!" Doug screamed, breaking the spell that held them. The group turned to flee, but the fog had thickened around them, and the boat, once so close, was now barely visible through the haze. The woman's song resumed, but this time it was different. The melody was twisted, discordant, filled with malice. It clawed at their minds, dragging them toward the water. Pete, unable to resist, stumbled forward, walking into the shallow waves. His eyes were glazed over, his face expressionless as he moved toward the woman. "Pete!" "No!" Tom shouted, but it was too late. With a sudden, inhuman speed, the woman lunged at Pete, her fingers elongating into sharp claws. She grabbed him by the neck, pulling him under the water with terrifying strength. Pete let out one last gurgled scream before he disappeared beneath the surface, the water bubbling and churning, as if something far larger than the woman was waiting below. The others ran, their hearts pounding as they scrambled toward the boat. The fog was so thick they could barely see, and the song echoed all around them, filling the air with its haunting call. They reached the boat and pushed off from the shore, rowing with all their strength as the woman's figure reappeared in the mist, her dark eyes fixed on them. The men rowed in silence, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their minds clouded with terror. Behind them, the fog parted, and the woman stood on the shore, her dark silhouette framed against the cliffs. For a moment it seemed as though they had escaped. The song had faded, and the waters around them were calm once again. But then, from beneath the boat, came a loud thud, followed by another. Something was hitting the hull from below, hard enough to shake the boat. "What the hell is that?" Doug whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the boat lurched violently, nearly capsizing as something massive struck it from beneath. The water around them began to bubble, and from the depths they saw them figures, pale and bloated, rising from the deep. They were the lost sailors of Deadmans' Cove, their faces twisted in eternal agony, their hands clawing at the sides of the boat. One by one, the men were pulled into the water, their screams swallowed by the sea. Tom fought with everything he had, kicking and thrashing as the cold hands wrapped around his legs, dragging him into the icy depths. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the woman's face, smiling down at him from the surface, her eyes black and empty. Days later, a search party found Tom's boat washed up on the shore, its hull cracked and covered in deep gouges, as if something had tried to tear it apart. The bodies of Pete, Doug, and Alan were never recovered. Tom was found unconscious on the beach, barely clinging to life. When he awoke in the hospital, he spoke of the woman, the song, and the creatures beneath the waves, but no one believed him. Deadmans Cove remains untouched, a place of mystery and death. Locals say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the Siren song drifting across the water, calling out to anyone foolish enough to enter her domain. And those who do never return.